Before the rise of the Babylonian Empire, Mesopotamia had been ruled by the ancient inhabitants of Sumer, downriver from Babylon. However, with the decline of this civilization, a new people to the north, called the Akkadians, rose to prominence. Their king, Sargon, conquered the entire region and united the Sumerians and Akkadians, creating the first great empire in Mesopotamia around 2350 BCE. This empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to Anatolia, but crumbled by 2250 BCE due to internal rebellions, and the invasions of Gutian tribesmen from the Zagros Mountains to the east, and semi-nomadic Amorites from the northwest. To what extent Sargon's empire was an actual empire is still debated. Sources mention trade routes with India and the Arabian Peninsula, and expeditions to Syria and the Levant, but it seems that most cities in Mesopotamia enjoyed a large amount of autonomy, and that military expeditions were issued with the objective of securing trade, and extending the Akkadian sphere of influence, rather than full-on conquest. After the fall of Sargon's empire, Mesopotamia came under the influence of the Gutians and Amorites. Nevertheless, the city-state of managed to resist them, and its leaders became the kings of Sumer and Akkad, founding the dynasty of The Gutians disappeared as a power, but the Amorites, on the other hand, were persistent and slowly displaced the local rulers. The dynasty of started to decline, and was replaced by small Amorite and Akkadian states. Hammurabi inherited the city-state of Babylon, one of these smaller Amorite states, in 1792 BCE. At that time, Babylon only consisted of the city and its farmlands, and was surrounded by similarly small kingdoms, centered on other minor cities. Hammurabi's first act was to unite all the cities and city-states of southern Mesopotamia, forming one large kingdom, ruled from mighty Babylon. After succeeding in uniting all Sumerian, Amorite, and Akkadian city-states along the banks of the two rivers, Hammurabi invaded and conquered Elam to the east, and the kingdoms of Mari and Ebla to the northwest. This secured Babylon's eastern borders, which had always been prone to raids by its neighbors from the Zagros Mountains. Late in his reign, Hammurabi attacked Assyria, then still called Sabatu, and forced them to pay tribute to Babylonia, making Babylonian rule over the Euphrates and Tigris rivers complete. Under his rule, the Babylonian Empire became a great power in the region. The city of Babylon itself grew into a vast and holy city. But upon Hammurabi's death in 1750 BCE, the Empire of Babylonia gradually started to decline, disintegrating into smaller states. Nevertheless, the citadel of Babylon managed to remain a large urban center because of its strong position, reputation, and many trade routes. Nowadays, Hammurabi is most remembered for the Code of Hammurabi, which is one of the best preserved law codes from ancient times. The code was carved into a great stele, a stone slab, and contains 280 judgments on civil and criminal law, dealing mainly with matters related to everyday life, such as corrupt administrations, theft, receiving stolen goods, robbery, looting, murder, abduction, taxes, merchant relations, slavery, divorces, dowries, and inheritances. Remarkably, the expression "an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth" is also inscribed in the code, a saying which has survived until the present day. Around 1595 BCE, roughly 150 years after the death of Hammurabi, a Hittite raid under Merciless I ravaged the weakened Babylonian state. The Hittites dethroned the last Babylonian ruler and sacked Babylon, putting an end to the empire founded by Hammurabi. With Babylon out of the picture, powers such as the Hurrian and Mitanni kingdoms managed to penetrate deeper into former northern Babylonian territory, while a semi-nomadic people named the Kassites moved into the region between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. The Kassites had started to encroach in increasing numbers on former Babylonian lands from 1800 BCE onwards, and managed to conquer the local Amorite and Akkadian states by 1450 BCE. The Kassite dynasty remained on the throne for many centuries, unlike the Hurrian and Mitanni kingdoms that were incorporated into the kingdoms of the Hittites and Assyrians. Although the beginning of the Kassite rule over Babylonia cannot be dated, it is known that their king, Agum II, ruled over parts of western Iran and the middle part of the Euphrates Valley. Native Babylonian princes continued to reign in southern Babylonia in the interim until the Kassite king, Ulam-Buriash, finally annexed this region around 1450 BCE. The Kassite rulers had strong international ambitions, and they established diplomatic ties with Egypt to trade gems for gold and to establish royal marriages. Their ambitions, however, brought them in conflict with the Assyrians, and so they allied with the Hittites to stop the rapid expansion of the Assyrians. During the reign of Kashtiliash IV in the 13th century BCE, Babylonia waged a destructive war on two fronts against the Assyrians and Elamites, which resulted in the catastrophic invasion and destruction of Babylon by the Assyrian king, Tukulti-Ninurta I, in 1225 BCE. Their Hittite allies suffered a similar defeat, resulting in the loss of Hittite territory in Asia Minor and the Levant to the Assyrians. After this disaster, the Babylonians slowly recovered and once again experienced a period of prosperity and peace in the following years. However, when another war with Elam broke out in 1185 BCE, the Kassite dynasty was ultimately crushed and replaced by a native dynasty from the city-state of Isin. With the Kassite dynasty overthrown, Marduk-Kabita-Hishu established what came to be known as the Second Dynasty of Isin in the 12th century BCE. However, this did not end hostilities with Babylon's Assyrian and Elamite neighbors, and Marduk-Kabita-Hishu waged wars against them to strengthen his new dynasty. Because of these early hostilities, his successors often needed to continue the fighting to maintain control over Babylonia, thus perpetuating hostilities between the three empires for decades. The most famous king of them all, Nebuchadnezzar I, fought such a campaign against Elam. The Elamites had conquered and ravaged a large part of Babylonia and were threatening the fragile city-state. A first attack on Elam failed due to an epidemic among Nebuchadnezzar's troops, but in a later campaign the Babylonian monarch succeeded in conquering and pillaging Susa, the capital of Elam. According to later writers, Nebuchadnezzar found a stolen Babylonian statue of the god Marduk in the Elamite capital of Susa, and returned it to its rightful place in Babylon. Soon after Nebuchadnezzar's successful expedition in Elam, their king was assassinated, and his kingdom fell apart into small states. This enabled the Babylonians to focus on other regions of the empire, and there was peace in Babylonian lands for a long period of time. During Nebuchadnezzar's reign, there were many extensive building projects, which further strengthened Babylon's position as one of the most prestigious and holiest cities of Mesopotamia. After Nebuchadnezzar's death, his brother, Marduk-Nadin-Ahai, took the throne and fought a costly war against the Assyrians, which finally ended in a major defeat for him. Weakened by war and a great famine ravaging the country, the empire was dealt its final blow by the invasion of Aramean tribes. Under the next several kings, the empire further disintegrated due to the continuous invasions of Semitic nomads, until once again a Kassite dynasty took control over Babylonia, in the 11th century BCE. The god Marduk was the most important of the Babylonian deities during Nebuchadnezzar's time. The older Sumerian pantheon had about 2,000 gods, but slowly they were integrated with other gods or goddesses with similar functions, reducing the overall amount to about 15 greater gods, and hundreds of minor gods. According to ancient poets, Marduk began his existence as an equal of one of the many gods of Babylon. But then, after destroying the powers of chaos, he was elevated to the status of king, over all other deities. To better integrate with the native people of Mesopotamia, the Kassites too made Marduk their most important god, and so further strengthened his position as head of the Babylonian pantheon. For almost 1,000 years, the epic of Marduk's victory over the forces of anarchy was recited during the New Year's festival in the spring, as part of the cult of Marduk in Babylon. Despite many years of conflict, and a raid on Babylon itself by the Assyrians, the threat of the Arameans and other Semitic nomadic tribes forced Babylonia and Assyria to make peace, to deal with the repeated attacks of these people. Even though the Babylonian kings still assumed grand titles, they were unable to stop the disintegration of the Babylonian Empire. The years between around 1000 BCE and 750 BCE were marked by Aramean invasions, and although the Babylonians and Assyrians were struggling to repel them, the Assyrians nevertheless succeeded in managing the situation better than the Babylonians. In the 9th century BCE, the Assyrians incorporated large parts of Mesopotamia that had been conquered by the Arameans, encountering little resistance from the Babylonians, who instead had to deal with palace intrigues and usurpers. After 780 BCE, the Assyrian power started to decline, when considerable lands in the north and west were lost, and the general, Tilgath-Pileser, deposed the former Assyrian king, thus creating the Neo-Assyrian Empire. This gave the Babylonians a chance under their new king Nabonidus to restore some of Babylonia's former power. Nabonidus allied himself with the new Assyrian king, Tilgath-Pileser III, and together they defeated the Arameans, after which the two kings continued to pursue amicable relationships, and Tilgath-Pileser visited the cities and temples in Babylonia. Nabonidus retained his independence, even though Assyria quickly recovered from the power change, and Tilgath-Pileser brought Assyria to its greatest territorial expansion, after conquering Syria, Armenia and Israel. However, when Nabonidus died, so did the friendly relationship between Babylonia and Assyria. During the reign of Nabonidus's successors, Tilgath-Pileser conquered Babylonia, dethroned the king, and assumed a Babylonian name, making himself the king of Assyria and Babylonia, thus ending its independence, and incorporating it into the Assyrian Empire. After Tilgath-Pileser's death, the new Assyrian Empire kept on growing, expanding further into Egypt, Asia Minor, Elam and even into what is now Iran, making it the largest empire in the entirety of the Middle East at that time. After several rebellions by the Babylonians during the 7th century BCE, the Assyrian king, Sennacherib, retaliated against the rebellious city. In 689 BCE, Babylon was conquered and completely destroyed, its temples plundered and leveled. The waters of the Arachtu Canal were diverted over the ruins, and the inner city remained almost completely uninhabited for 8 years. These harsh measures also upset many Assyrians, because they too considered Babylon to be a holy city. In the 7th century BCE, a series of wars erupted between the Assyrian Empire and the people it had subdued. The king of Babylonia, who was the brother of the Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal, formed a secret alliance with the Medes, Elamites, Arameans, Arabs, and Egyptians to overthrow his brother. When the Elamites were defeated prematurely, the king of Babylonia decided to act, calling upon the alliance to go to war in 652 BCE. However, the rebellion was crushed, and Ashurbanipal captured Babylon, eliminating his brother who died in his palace when it was set ablaze. A series of punitive attacks were launched by the Assyrians to deal with those who dared rise against them. The Arabs were quickly defeated, and Elam became an Assyrian province after their capital, Susa, had been destroyed. The rest of Ashurbanipal's reign was more peaceful, and Assyria reached the zenith of its power. At this point in history, Babylonia was surpassed culturally and economically by Assyria. The tide turned when, in 635 BCE, a civil war erupted in the Assyrian heartland, and they could no longer fight off foreign invasions. In 626 BCE, the Chaldeans, who had settled in southern Babylonia, revolted in Uruk and occupied Babylon, while the Scythians laid waste to Syria and Palestine. In 625 BCE, Cyaxares of the Medes began to conquer the eastern provinces of Assyria. Then, a combined army of Chaldean Babylonians and Medes marched on Nineveh. A former attempt by the Medes to take the city had been thwarted by the Scythians, but in 612 BCE the Medes and Babylonians succeeded in destroying Nineveh, and with it, the Assyrian Empire. The invaders took their revenge on the local inhabitants and, 200 years later, Xenophon, a Greek mercenary serving the king of the Persian Empire, found the country sparsely populated. In a few decades, the mighty Assyrians went from capturing Babylon and Susa to ceasing to exist as an empire. With Assyria gone as a major power, several new ones rose in its place. The Median Empire in Iran, a new Egyptian kingdom in Egypt, and the Neo-Babylonian Empire in the rest of the Middle East. Babylonia entered its last period of glory with Nebuchadnezzar II as its most successful king, remembered best for capturing Jerusalem, capital of Judah, in 597 BCE. Following the revolt of Jerusalem in 587 to 586 BCE, many residents were carried off to Babylon, and kept there for several generations. Babylon during this period was perhaps the most impressive city in the world. The wealth of trade and empire was expended on monuments, ziggurats, and palaces. The giant walls and the Ishtar Gate were described in detail by Herodotus and listed as one of the wonders of the world. The famous Hanging Gardens were built to resemble a verdant mountain, to remind Nebuchadnezzar's wife of her homeland. This status stood in vast contrast with the condition of the city during Assyrian rule. The final Babylonian Empire lasted until 539 BCE. During that year, the people of Babylon surrendered their city without a fight to the great Persian king, Cyrus II. They had grown tired of their incompetent ruler, Nabonidus, and were ready to accept the wise and capable Persian king. The Persian Empire would become one of the most powerful empires to have ever existed in the East.